All right, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
All right, super. Well, I think some of you know Paul Friedman, and Paul emailed me a little while ago, and he said, this is a very special group of people, and what we usually do in this format at Southern Oregon University for the Holistic Conference, which I've presented in person several times over the past years, they said, do something thought-provoking for about 15 minutes and then just get these people involved in conversation. And that's what I really want to do with you all. And when we do that dialogue, we'll learn to get to know each other a little bit, so we can forego the introductions, because you'll introduce yourself when we talk about this this important problem in the world that we're all facing, and we could frame it in an educational way that relates to this conference as the failure of holistic education to get what it wants to do done in education, or the extinction of our life on Earth. So we have a whole gamut of challenges that we're going to be talking about today. And I titled this thought-provoking, maybe 10 or 15 minute slide presentation that I put together, which I rarely do, as going deeper, and you'll see why. I put in, going deeper into our hearts, going deeper into the cosmos, deeper into the roots of our Mother Earth, going deeper into our hearts. So I'll kind of give you a sense of why this happens. But let's begin with a traditional opening. The Lakota, and all the times that I give presentations, we always try to tune into our higher selves and into the universe. So I'd like everyone to just kind of take a nice deep breath and put yourself into most of you guys meditate. Allow yourself to get into that lower brainwave frequency so that you have both sides of the brain working in the corpus callosum in balance. And I'm going to say the prayer in Lakota. Otunkashila wakantanka nama kompo nata tewato po unshima ka hituayam kelo. Oyate oyase unchi wichalapo na oichakia po hecho wichozani washte when you at big telo. Oyate oyase chankuluto och namani oichakia po. Ihani lako wichuanki tunkashila kiksuye. And you can have a look and get a sense of what we're going to be bringing into our conversation. Now, I want to make a distinction, since most of you know this is about indigenous worldview. I want to make a distinction between two ideas. One is place-based indigenous knowledge, and one is indigenous worldview. And I want to make a clarification on that, because a lot of folks in education, especially, and Indian country is divided on this as well, feel it's not appropriate for non-indigenous people to learn this material or to teach it. And this distinction will help you with that. There's TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, place-based indigenous knowledge. That's vital. This is what we have to fight to save, and people are on the front lines around the world fighting for, and their sovereignty. But this place-based indigenous knowledge requires knowing the language really completely, and knowing the ceremonies completely, and having multi-generationally observed knowledge of the geographic area. And it's vital. It's vital in our world. And very few people have it anymore. The indigenous cultures, I have 17 or so Navajo students, and they tell me 60 to 80% of the Navajo Nation essentially has lost its this place-based knowledge. That many of the ceremonies have been lost, and of course the languages all over are being lost. One indigenous language per week. So that's something we want to fight for, but it's nothing that we can do. We don't have that knowledge. Now, indigenous worldview is in common to all these unique First Nations. And that belongs to everybody. And so if anyone wants to get more detail on this, go to my peer-reviewed article at the University of British Columbia's Critical Education. You can find it online real easily by just putting in the indigenization controversy, for whom, by whom. And it'll give you the confidence to know that this is work for all educators. As Fool Scroll said about indigenous people who, and you have to respect them for this and understand about misappropriation. But those of my friends who say, this shouldn't be shared, Fool's Grove says, they don't know the medicine that well. And so I think that's real important. I have, this is one of the presents I was given for some of the work that I've done in Canada, but you'd be surprised how many indigenous cultures are asking for this worldview to come back into their educational systems. And that's what this is about. In fact, I'll send you the video that UNESCO closed with that I did. It's about a 2-minute video. I'll send it on, put it in a link for you afterwards so you can watch it. Some of you have seen it, I think. But I did that video for the indigenous people of Papua New Guinea. It wasn't, it was just a surprise that UNESCO closed their sustainability conference in British Columbia with it. But I actually did that for indigenous people because they are losing their worldview as well. And this is what I'll send you here. This is the 2-minute video, and then the worldview chart. You'll just to have, I'm going to have everybody have a look at it when they get a chance, so that you can see what it is that we're sort of talking about here when we talk about worldview. Okay, and the chart is not intended as a rigid binary, which we're going to talk about, but you can get a sense of the non-binary, potentially complementary continuum between the two worldviews. Just have a look at those real kind of so you have a sense of the work that we can do by bringing balance, by bringing back into play an emphasis on the indigenous worldview. Okay. And is everybody, has everyone seen the video? Okay, so we'll just go on. So what my basic idea here is holistic education without metacognitive worldview reflection on these two worldviews, the dominant worldview and the indigenous worldview, the colonial and the pre-colonial. It doesn't go deep enough, as my title with all the deep things was telling us. And of course, we know what holistic education is, but basically, this isn't going deep enough, right? And it's not that this is a surprise for anybody, because the same can be said about lots of approaches. Holistic education, character education, critical pedagogy, counter-hegemonic education, decolonizing education, developmental theory education, religious education, split brain. I've written articles and books on a number of these things, promoting them in many places, but none of them are engaging worldview sufficiently. Now, holistic education probably is the best named approach, because in its own word, holistic, it is coming closer to what we're trying to accomplish. So I propose that a complementary focus on metacognitive worldview reflection on the dominant materialistic anthropocentric worldview and the spiritual animistic indigenous one is essential for all of these things, but especially for higher question, for holistic education, and these deeper questions. This is a quote by Aristotle Nandi. Amidst growing global concern about the moral decay in society, character education in schools has taken center stage, but the programs are incomplete without going deeper and getting to the fundamental questions of life. Now, Jack Miller, one of our holistic education gurus, and I co-authored a couple of articles together, and are good friends. But he says when indigenous people speak about our relationship to the earth and the universe, it doesn't come from the head, but from a much deeper place. And much of holistic education is about embodiment, but we can learn from indigenous education about how to get to this deeper integration, right? And of course, Ron Miller, the other holistic education guru, has talked about this as well, introducing a kinship worldview and going deeper in whole education. Jack Miller's international book on holistic education has an article about this from a deeper place, indigenous worlding as the next step in holistic education. And of course, the Holistic Education Review just came out. Paul has been we just got it accepted as a book, and so this is an amazing collection of indigenous authors that I've gathered and edited for the journal, and it just came out, so you can go there and read how these authors go deeper as well. I mentioned Ron Miller, the other guru of holistic education. He wrote in a book quite a while back. He said, as I understand holistic education, it doesn't really describe one philosophy, but it's supposed to express an underlying worldview that questions the dominant worldview. And so this, I think, gives a lot of credibility to this idea. Now, so if we have the leaders in holistic education talking about indigenous worldview and writing articles and books and trying to get people to do it, why isn't it happening? Well, Colco Rivera, one of the great psychologists who has contributed to this concept of worldview, he says, how some authors describe the value of the worldview as important to their discipline. But it's absent in standard texts, handbooks, encyclopedias, and teaching, and so forth. And so he calls it, that worldview is the most important construct that the typical psychologist has never heard of. Well, we could say the same thing with our beautiful holistic education teachers. So the provoking statement here is that this is the foundation for the work that we need to do in education. Worldviews, according to Colco Rivera, is the most important construct that typical psychologists ever heard of, but we can say that for all of the disciplines: medicine, psychology, education, you name it. And Chesterton, of course, his famous quote, we think that the question is not whether the theory of the cosmos affects matters, but whether in the long run anything else does. And now most people, when they think about worldview, they think about, everybody's got a worldview. A culture is a worldview, a religion is a worldview, a philosophy is a worldview. But that isn't how even the original German Weltanschauung was meant. It really is a much deeper construct, and sort of the father of social anthropology out of the University of Chicago, Robert Redfield, his team said really there were three worldviews, but then the Eastern one kind of subsumed itself into the Western one in terms of its, not so much its spiritual traditions per se, but in terms of the institutions of education, economics, etc. And so he says there's just two essential worldviews. There's the pre-colonial worldview, the dominant worldview, a materialistic worldview, and that is in concert with the pre-colonial worldview or the indigenous worldview. And he said the destruction of the indigenous worldview over the last several thousand years has been the greatest of all tragedies in human history. And so, okay, so we're going to start to get into your questions here, but I want to talk about the non-binary aspect, which is a complicated part of looking at this. When people look at the chart that you looked at before, I mean, good liberal professors, friends of mine, first thing, if they're sharp about the problem of binary and duality, they'll say, oh, this is a rigid binary. You're contrasting these opposites, saying one's good, one's bad. etc. But they're looking at that through their dominant worldview, because the indigenous worldview is a non-binary worldview. And the problem with worldview studies over the last couple hundred years it's been about religion versus science, science versus science, religion versus religion. It's been about shutting down dialogue instead of opening it up. And so we have to begin to look at these very different worldview precepts. With the metaphor of the left and right brain, if you will, but I'm writing a huge 15,000 word article I've been invited to write for the General Review of Psychology. And I'm going to be talking about Ian McGilchrist's 2,000 page book that came out recently on left and right brain, never mentioning worldview, never mentioning indigeneity, but talking about how the left and right brain are out of balance, and that's our problem. It's a lot easier for us to look at the precepts that are in the 40 scholarly precepts that we can actually deal with than to give credit to this oversimplification of laterality and the split brain. But it's a great metaphor for looking at our chart. Okay. Speaking of the chart, I received this not long ago from Jeremy Lint, who The Guardian described as the greatest, one of the greatest thinkers of our age. And it's a copy that he blew up of our worldview chart and put on his fence in Berkeley, California. And so he sent that to me, and I thought that was a cool thing to show you. Of course, besides bringing this into our education system, which is what our time today is about, the holistic education perspective, there is also evidence that this has a large survival aspect. Most of you might have seen the May 2019 biodiversity report. It was on the front page of every country in the world for a day, talking about, the horrors of 1 million more extinctions of all kinds of species, flora and fauna, within one generation, talking about the 80% of all biodiversity on the earth is on only 20% of the landmass, etc. But I had this published in The Nation because I read the report, and 7 times in it talks about where indigenous worldview is operating and people have some control of the land. This extinction rate is non-existent or severely reduced. And so we titled the article, "The Media Missed a Crucial Message in the United Nations Biodiversity Report." And if we want to halt the extinction crisis, we need to embrace indigenous worldviews. So this is a pretty big deal, right? Pretty big deal. And I could talk about it for a long time, but I really want us to get into a conversation. And let's see if we can do this. So stop sharing. Okay, was that thought-provoking enough for you guys to stimulate some talk? I mean, I know some of you know my work already, and some of you have looked at this. But hey, Paul, good to see you. And so I should ask Paul if that was thought-provoking enough. But let's see what you all say. One of the questions that is well, how do we do this? And we'll try to get to that too with talking about some of the approaches. But let's just go through the. Just jump in, or I'm going to call on you. All right, Josette, are you going to join?
Yes.
You volunteer. Oh, girl.
The one out of the crowd. Hi, 4 hours. How are you today?
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Well, I'd love to have the link to that YouTube video because I haven't had an opportunity to watch that yet. And I'd love to see the listing of the charter in more depth and detail so I could read through it more thoroughly.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to put that up on the screen so we can do that. I think that will help with the question. So I think we're going to for sure do that. And how many others have not seen the worldview show? Would you like me to show it? It's only 2.5 minutes.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Let me see if I can find it real quick. And I'll go back to my PowerPoint, I guess, and get it. And I'll put it up for you. I'll share the screen again and we'll just show it to you real quick. And keeping in mind that, you know, I did this under the my international Fulbright volunteer work for indigenous peoples. And I think that's really important to know that we're all in the same boat and we're all trying to work this together. So, okay, so share screen, and
the earth is suffering. Climate change, pollution, and pandemics are some of the consequences of human-created assaults on our world. According to the United Nations Biodiversity Report, 1 million more species face imminent extinction, including us. We must live on Earth differently, if not for ourselves, for future generations. 80% of global biodiversity now exists on only 20% of the Earth. It is no coincidence that this small amount of land is mostly managed by indigenous cultures. According to 450 multidisciplinary scientists, extinction rates have been less severe or avoided entirely in these areas held by indigenous people. We can all learn to live with greater respect for our non-human life forms. This is possible if we embrace the religion that has guided us throughout our existence on this planet. In contrast to the dominant worldview, the indigenous one truly emphasizes our relationship to the land, the environment, and all its interconnected inhabitants. Without remembering this one that's with all of life, we are doomed. Regional and global scenarios currently lack explicit considerations of the indigenous worldview. It is also important that we do our best to protect and support the remaining indigenous cultures. They are fighting against all odds to protect the last of Earth's biodiversity. And while doing this, we can all re-embrace the worldview indigenous peoples share. We can come to understand that human relationship with nature is a continuous two-way dialogue, that natural resources are better thought of as relatives and teachers. Gratitude is essential. The universe is constantly in flux, time is circular. Respect for diversity, equality, and justice is crucial. Spirit is in all things, and that human knowledge must be joined by a fearless trust in the unknowable mysteries of nature. Let us remember who we really are and reestablish our intended way of being with respect, generosity, gratitude, and of course, the happiness that comes from this. The temporary curiosity we all need.
okay,
Thank you.
so
That was beautiful.
so that
just-
gives you a little bit of a
Castro
sense, huh?
was able to win.
So
any
I'm gonna go
competition
chart,
she took part in. It was known as the contest
indigenous
because she had won 7 trips to Paris.
worldview, and just I'll put that in. And you can see if you just put indigenous worldview chart, it's the first thing that
Oh,
comes
I
up.
see. Right.
And then Kindred Media, they actually they are selling posters of it, and all the proceeds, of course, go to indigenous organizations. But to get so you get a sense of it, we'll just hold it up here. So See, there might be there we go. Not sure why the whole thing isn't coming up. Maybe it'd be easier for me to just get mine. I'll just turn that off and go to worldview charts. And there we go. I'll make it as big as I can. All right. And again, it's not intended as a rigid binary, but a true dichotomy, best viewed as a continuum. It's meant to encourage seeking complementarity and dialogue. Absolutism is discouraged, even if it's just looking at how the opposite is causing problems in the world and why it is, to understand this sense of what we call what Jung called the union of the opposites. And the rest of the PowerPoint that I started, I have about 6 or 7 slides about the concept of non-duality. Hilary Webb's wonderful book, Yan Tan and the Andean Worldview, speaks of it. It's kind of like you can't have a mountain without a valley. It's being able to understand how like if you look at rigid hierarchy, for example, and non-hierarchy, most indigenous cultures were non-hierarchical, matriarchal societies, and most of our systems in economics, education, politics, etc., are rigid in the dominant worldview. However, obviously, there's exceptions. People have different thoughts about them. I've had some people say, well, 4 arrows, I really, live with a strong social purpose. How come, why are you telling me I don't on this other side? Well, it's not about each individual. It's about the system you're living in. Almost every person that has said that, their colleagues or their people on the call, or maybe I did it once in a while, would ask a few questions and they go, oh, you mean if my organization is promoting this and keeping us from it, or if in my education in my classroom I'm not really teaching this, or it's the manifestations in our systems that are guiding us, even though secretly or personally we might think, well, I don't see the earth as an unliving it at all, and yet you start to look at how we live our lives, and we're all in this contradiction of moving an emphasis on the left side here into how we operate in the world. But for example, the continuum idea can be reflected in number 1. The Lakota, for example, were a matriarchy and very non-hierarchical, except during the buffalo hunt. During the buffalo hunt, a particular person would be named as running the show for safety and knowing the particular group of buffalo and where they are and everything. And it became a rigid hierarchy. Of course, after the hunt was over, then it went back and sharing of the meat and all that. That was non-hierarchical. And then on the next hunt, it would be a different leader, right? So this is what we're talking about by looking at these ideas. So just kind of just gander at them and begin to look at your own life and what you're doing in your life. How much of it is involved with or accepting, whether you agree or not, on the left side? More head than heart? Seeing competition as being about winning and feeling superior and either not participating in it or doing so with an ego of winning, as opposed to seeing your partner as helping you develop your positive potential and vice versa. Human-centered, how often are you really going out and learning from the trees and the animals and the insects? How are we using our words to deceive ourselves or others? And how deeply do you recognize that you're a spirit involved in a body learning experience? And how often are you really engaging the spirits? So you see what I'm saying? Dualistic thinking, how much of the either or are you really buying into? Do you see injustice as being about bringing people back into community? Do you see ceremony as a formality, or do you see it as an opportunity for trance-based learning and essential? Or do you even see trance, like the three Abrahamic religions all see the phenomenon of hypnosis and talk about it as stemming from evil? And yet it's a key natural phenomenon for transformation, and explains why human beings with all their intelligence are poisoning our air and our water. So seeing nature as dangerous, etc. So you all have kind of a little bit of a sense for this, and I'll just put this on park over here so we can come back to it if we need to. So Josette, does that give you
Yeah, that's beautiful.
graph?
Thank you so much for that. You know, and you know, my work is about, you know, relationship and relationship specifically with children. And this is relationship with each other, relationship with the earth. And these innate capacities that we have available to us as humans are brought forward with the nurturing relationships we grow within. And, you know, who could argue with anything you're saying? I mean, it's like,
especially with
that's-
children. You know, Daniel, I just got a letter from Stanford where I presented a couple of weeks ago, and Daniel Wildcat, a friend of mine, is presenting on how children relationships are now becoming all about the flat computer screen and
Oh, that's so
artificial things made by
terrible.
humans. And of course, you know, the book Last Child in the Woods talked about that years ago,
Yeah.
but this helps with that relationship to bring them into that. And of course, our new book that came out, Random House is distributing it. It's called Restoring the Kinship Worldview. Our first article in it is about sending young children, is a true story about how one tribe would send young children out into the dark woods at night to find their spirit animal and to, you know, to really get engaged with that. And that book, UC Berkeley's Science Center for the Greater Good has selected the book as one of the most thought-provoking and inspiring and practical science books of 2022. So I think this material is ready at long last of, you know, a 500 years minimum of anti-Indianism, which I write about in Unlearning the Language of Conquest, that continues today, and the scientific racism that is still continuing, and
it's led to trauma. It's just led to trauma in the culture. And I just feel like we are recovering, we're constantly recovering and regaining these relationships with our innate capacities and with each other and with the earth. And it's unfortunate to have gone the way of trauma instead of the way of health and well-being, given the resources of the culture.
So AG, I see my colleague AG there. He'll have something to say, I know, and maybe it'll be a good challenging question.
Well, hello. Yes, I was just wrestling with the complexity of trying to escape the non-binary when many minds are so rigid that they can't even entertain the binary. It's just one way or no way. And so just wrestling with the complexity of trying to get worldviews to entertain even indigenous thought. And also just the aspirational qualities of delineating all of the elements and kind of counter juxtaposing them. I was looking at my own world, not necessarily my worldview, but how my world is inconsistent with it. One of those being human contact. Because of what we've become, I don't seek that, which I know that my spirit man wants that, but because of what I've seen humans become, I'd rather have that plant and animal contact. So those are some of the thoughts that came to me.
Well, those are the same things that I've wrestled with through this whole time and trying to implement it. So thank you for pointing them out. You know, one example of the challenges of the accepting of this duality, non-duality reality is there's a guy named Walter Block, who is an endowed professor at Loyola of economics. And he refers to himself as a Jewish atheist libertarian. And everything he's written, I've disagreed with, like, at a gut level vehemently, right? So I called him up and asked him if he would co-author a book with me. And the book came out, and it's called Differing Worldviews, Two Scholars Argue Cooperatively. And the rule was we could not debate. We had to try to understand how two well-published authors could be so completely different. We actually became friends. Now, I got to give a caveat to that. I gave a copy of the book to Alice Walker, who's my neighbor here in Mexico, of the color purple. And Alice thumbed through it for about 30 seconds and threw it in a waste can. I had it autographed to her and everything right in front of me, you know? And I went, Alice, will you let me know? And she says, you're in bed with the devil, right? And so I disagree with it, but understand it, right? But if you go on YouTube, put in St. Louis University, Social Justice Center, Block and Four Arrows, you can watch us present. And at the end, he had more fans than I did, because St. Louis was pretty conservative. But you know, people would come up to me for the book signing and say, well, you know, for a lefty, you're not bad, or something like that. There was no vitriol, right? And then some of my, you know, my fans would go up to him and say, well, Dr. Block, I sure disagree with some of the things you say, like when you say only humans have intrinsic value and everything else on earth is for utilitarian purposes for human beings. I can't tell you how hard that is for me to hear from you, but I'm really honored that you're up there with Four Arrows and you guys are trying to work it out. There was no vitriol, right? And so I think that's just one example that comes to mind. In terms of going through these things, they are so interconnected. You can't just compare left side to right side. You got to look at how several of them on the left side are intricately connected with others on the left side, and same thing on the right side. And by getting into that and beginning to play with it and understand, well, okay, I see this. You really can begin to focus an intentionality at a cognitive level. But as we'll talk about towards the end here, you know, I refer to something that came to me in a near-death vision after a kayaking accident here in Mexico, where the whole river disappeared into an underground hole, and a mountain lion and a fawn were involved in the whole story. That turned into letters: a cat and fawn. Cat is concentration activated transformation. Ceremony for indigenous peoples was an opportunity to practice this phenomenon of hypnosis, that they understood if we believe in an image with intentionality, then we can remain generous, then we can remain, you know, strong. Indigenous origin stories, they all talk about the same problems that we all have. They all talk about greed and they all talk about jealousy, but they had an understanding of how to do it. Now, this idea of hypnosis, if anything, it's captured by the Rush Limbaughs and the dictators in the world, right? And they use it brilliantly, whereas we allow it to mold us. So getting in touch with self-hypnosis and understanding the simplicity of it, getting in touch with using ceremony for it or other ways of doing it to help realize these, like, for example, all right, I am, and we all are in this non-contact with humans. And you know, schools are creating silos to maintain it for their managerial powers, you know, and so what are we going to do about it? Well, we start thinking cognitively about why are we in that participation, and then when we think, what are the ways to start to change that? How do I live my life in a way to change that? We've got to use the self-hypnosis for motivation. So thank you. That was great. Paul.
Howdy. Hey, Four Arrows, it is good to see you. It is no surprise that you are full of energy. You're looking great.
Yeah, but no eyebrows and no hair. I got to tell you, that people don't know. I just came back from Houston, Texas, chemotherapy number 2, and so that's why Paul said that. So thank you, Paul.
Yeah, really, really great to see you. It's been a little bit. Personal notes first. I just want to say I'm missing Robin here tonight. Robin, for those who don't know, has had a tragedy in her life, personal loss. And I encourage others to join me in sending her and her family lots of love and good wishes. I'm so glad to see some of my dear friends here. Josette, it's been too long. Nice to see you. Phil, Kim, Young Hee, Aya, Andrea and Cam, Viola. And for those who I don't know yet or don't know well, why don't we know each other? Let's connect. This is such a nice opportunity to be sort of a point of contact, I think, for all of us in Four Arrows. I really appreciate you provoking thoughts as you have done. I have one question, or I mean, I have 10,000 questions, but I'll ask one, which is in the 40 precepts, number 2 and number 25 use a word that's very meaningful to me. And I wonder if I could ask you to tell a little bit about what you mean when you use the word courage.
Well, I see courage as an indigenous worldview sees courage as moving into fearlessness, and I'll briefly explain that. In Larry Brentro's book, Broken Leg, he says that for the Lakota, the highest expression of courage, isn't even standing up, to speak your truth or fighting a bear. It's generosity. It's giving the most precious thing that you have away. And so from that, we start to look at this idea of courage. It takes a lot of energy. If I were to have you, come up and visit me on Vancouver Island, I'll take you to a creek where there's this 30-foot mountain rock that we climb by a waterfall that the bears go up to grab salmon out of the waterfall, and you can jump into it. It's safe, but it's scary for people, to want to jump 30 feet into something. And if you get the courage to do it, and you jump, you just jump, and you go all the way down, and you hit the water, and you get out, and you go, oh man, I don't want to do that again. But if at the top, once you make the decision to act, you move into fearlessness. Now, most Western philosophers say fearlessness is foolishness. Gandhi was the only one who said differently. Fearlessness is trusting the universe. And once you make this commitment, then, now you jump. You see an eagle overhead. You see a salmon in the water. You feel the air rushing past you. You feel the plunge of your feet and the bubbles in the water and the coolness of it. And there's no burnout. Many activist friends of mine are burning out who are courageous, right? So I think that that number 25 is a really important one. And having the fear-based thoughts and behaviors, I would say 70% of them come from the first 5 years of life, from the early childhood hypnosis. We're in hypnosis for the first 5 years, and there's something there. But traumatic experiences along the way can happen. And so if you look at just 4 worldview precepts about fear, authority, words, and nature, this is the cat fawn. What is it that I am afraid of that relates to this issue that I'm having some problems with? What is the fear there? And then connect that on whose authority do I define that fear? Or do I feel the fear? Or has that fear come to me? On whose authority? Was it my dad or a preacher or what? An accident, a trauma? And what words do I use? And again, this ties to the importance of sacredness of words. Words are self-hypnotic. If you say, I have to be on time versus I want to be on time, it will change the dynamics of the stressors inside of you, right? So what words do I use when I deal with this particular thought? And how have I not used nature to overcome this fear? And how can I use it? So just those four things is one technique for getting in touch with this idea of fearless trust in the universe. So I hope that helps a little bit as a short answer.
Yeah. And I'll just say to me, one aspect of courageous being that you model for us, as you explained, was just a willingness to have dialogue across worldviews. You know, that I'm so drawn to engage with like-minded folks, educators and pedagogues and so on. And it's super comfortable. And it's very reassuring and reifying it takes real courage. And I love what Parker Palmer says about the etymology of courage coming from the heart. You know, it's takes real courage to engage like that. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Who else? You got somebody else who want to jump in, or you want me to call on you? Susie, you had experience with the courage of getting engaged with worldview. Can you just maybe share with everybody what you're going, what happened to you, or what any questions that you have?
Yeah, I actually I have really interesting, actually just had today a very interesting conversation with another faculty member around this idea of two worldviews or not. And I think what has helped me is really studying the Robert Redfield basis. And I guess my question is for you, because this other faculty member is very stuck in this idea that if we're talking about just two worldviews, we're kind of taking away the, she talked about like some revolutions and how in different cultures in Cuba and Brazil, how they really were forward thinking. She doesn't feel like we're going back to an indigenous worldview. And she said they have done this even not knowing about indigenous worldview. So I think it is pretty, I used to be really afraid to talk about this because I don't really like controversy, but I have found that I am more grounded in it now, but that's still, I didn't have a really good answer for her with that.
Well, the first thing is to keep in mind, you don't need to call it anything, right? You can call it a kinship worldview, as we do with the book. You can call it a spiritual worldview, whatever. It's recognizing the worldview precepts, and this is what scholars, like the ones I quoted, are doing, and why they say it's so important. It's the fundamental, So one doesn't have to do that, but you can look at any revolution or anything, and you can say, well, which of these 40 precepts were guiding the revolutionaries? And how many of them are wound up replicating the same problems that they started because they didn't recognize the difference between such and such and such and such, right? And so this is what I had mentioned earlier. A number of my own liberal friends and professors really they squirm at anything that brings things down to a binary because they've seen the problems of binaries, right? And so but they're looking at it through the binary worldview, right? And so it's a very tricky idea. It's been written about. Carl Jung wrote about it in his work on the union of opposites. My criticism of Ian McGilchrist's 2,000-page book is when he refers to the left and right brain, he is calling one the master and one the emissary. And my criticism is that he even uses one Iroquois a misinterpretation from a book on the founding fathers of America that interpret this indigenous one. But this is the fundamental mythology of indigenous people, the twin stories, right? And so The twin stories are all about this balance between the sun and the moon, the balance, which would be the balance between the left brain and the right brain, even though one is left-handed and one's right-handed, one is cold, one is hot, whatever, right? And you look at our origin stories, the novel have a story called Where the Two Come to the Father. And the monster slayer is the solar twin. Child born of the water is the lunar twin. They come to the monster with the long arms. Of course, the monsters are those things in us like greed and jealousy, envy. And monster slayer says, I'm so good with my bow and arrow, I can get him. Child born of the water, the lunar twin, said, or you might think of that as the right brain twin, says, I think as long as arms are so long, he'll get that arrow before he gets to him, and we're not going to get past him. Well, monster slayer says, well, what should we do? And child born of the water says, let's sing to him. They sing to him. The monster, never having been treated that way, lets them pass. Well, all of the indigenous twin stories are like that. Okay, even if one is bitter cold and one is warm and hearted, they're all ultimately in partnership. Now jump to Greek, Roman, Western based origin stories. Romulus and Remus, Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Hercules, Iphicles, the whole list of them. The solar twin emerges, sometimes killing the lunar twin, right? And so Joseph Campbell says these myths are foundational in our understanding of, we don't really pay much attention to them, but they're there, right? And so, yeah, so people that recognize that halfway are going to be vehemently fighting against any binary. But if you look at worldview discussions, they almost always, and I just been invited to write an article for the General Psychology Review, 15,000 words on decolonizing psychology. And I said, I'm not going to pull punches. The APA's leadership over the eugenics, and they said, that's why we ask you, right? Well, if you really look and understand that these discussions about different worldviews, you'll see the same things that are on the chart. People will be talking about, one or the other. But we don't want to say that there's two worldviews. We want to say that there's a million of them, and that, what flavor ice cream you want is a worldview. But now the scholarship of, starting with Robert Redfield, and more people are starting to recognize that there's the phenomenon of colonialism. Colonialism cultured and nurtured the worldview that is what we now are being dominated by. And so you have if we talk about decolonizing, we got to talk about pre-colonizing, which is talking about indigenizing, which is about a way of being in the world. So it's a hard one. You can't, and you're not going to win them all. And you're not going to win them with indigenous people either, because of the fear and the anger and the resentment of what's going on in the world, right? So thank you for that. Who else? We only got 10 more minutes. I knew this would go fast.
Yeah. 4 hours, it's Phil.
Phil, good to see you.
Yeah. In the recent issue of Holistic Ed Review, there was a beautiful article by Etheline Ironclad Two Dogs.
Yes.
Where she talked about the Lakota epistemology.
Yeah, she's the wife of my Sundance leader, Rick Two Dogs.
So what flowed through me was the importance of story. And I just thought you might address that importance.
I think story is key in helping people understand this, because instead of leading with the mind, as I was doing just now, if you can just tell a story that begins to show this complementarity potentiality, and that it's still about the solar twin and the lunar twin, it's not about all the cousins and all the other family members and all the different philosophies and ideologies. It's about these two dynamics, right? These two dynamics that are operating in the world, and the various manifestations of them. And the story, I think gets that through, and that's why storytelling is probably the best way to teach this. But with the cat fawn work, you're telling your own story. You're looking at the challenges that you have, and you're going, "What's the story that brought me to this?" So it's a beautiful question, Phil. Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about how, a lot of us are educators, how we can bring more of the indigenous worldview into the classroom?
Yes, I really think the chart is the key to it, right? Because it's right there in front of you, and if people start to say, "Hey, we're all in the same boat," don't look at one as evil and one as good. Look at this as there are reasons for this, and that we've got to try to understand why there's a low respect for women generally in the world, and and at all different developmental ages, these conversations can be talked about. So how often do you, have a sense of a social purpose, or how do you feel about the nature? Are you afraid of things in nature? Are you afraid of snakes? Are you, and getting involved with these at all different grade levels, and starting to realize that there are alternative ways of thinking, and these alternative ways have largely been oppressed in every way, and so I think that is the easiest way to begin the conversations. And and maybe don't refer to it as indigenous, because that history of the hegemony against indigeneity is so strong, even in children. Don't even refer to it. Take that and make a new copy of the chart, and just say, two worldviews. Don't call it anything, right? Maybe a kinship. Yeah.
But we're in a classroom where there are no plants, there are no animals, it's people, it's computers.
Well, anytime you can get out of a classroom, I mean, that's an option, you try to do. But in it, you can bring plants and animals in. You can get people to visualize and imagine. Einstein says imagination is more powerful than knowledge, and using imagination and visualization in classrooms is a second option to not being able to really go out and do it. I hate using flat screen mechanisms, but doing some of the documentaries about animals, and then stopping and having people talk about what animals have you seen in your life, and what's one are you afraid of, and maybe someone will say, well, cockroach, I hate cockroaches, my mom hates cockroaches. Then go on Google and say, look at all the amazing things about cockroaches. I did that on a vision quest. I was on a vision quest because I was going to Rick Two Dogs Sundance, and I was in Idaho at 5,000 feet altitude. And I knew that I wasn't acclimated to 114 degrees dance. I said, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do this. She says, you better go up and do an omelette. So I went up and did my vision quest. And right away, a rat comes into my tobacco ties, starts eating one of them, eating the tobacco. And I'm not being tuned in yet. And, just having sat down, I kicked it away. And I went, oh, geez, that was what was being sent to me. But it came back. Long story short, came back and sat in the middle of that circle facing the west, and had big back legs of some kind of a rat-like creature. All I could think about for the rest of the night when it left was, I got to get to a computer, because I'm in Idaho. I don't have anybody to talk to about animals. I just moved there. I don't know about this. I don't have a history of this. So I got started my fire for the Inipi, and burned my clothes, and jumped up on my computer, and I put in mammals of North America. And it had the Latin name. English name was the kangaroo rat, the only mammal in North America that can go a lifetime without a drop of water. Okay, so I mean, we've got to do the best that we can with what we've got, but we're not doing that. That's a beautiful question. Thank you. Well, we're at the end of our time, and if anybody ever has any questions, feel free to email me. Let me just close, because we're in difficult times. You know, I was at UBC just before the pandemic and doing a presentation at the education department at University of British Columbia, and somebody raised their hand and says, "So, Four Arrows, do you think that we can turn things around if we begin this worldview work?" And it just came on to me, John. I said, "No." And people went from loving me to hating me in that moment. And the hands went up and someone said, "Why are you here? We know you donate your monies for your books and your things, you know, to indigenous cause. Why are you here if you don't have any hope?" You know, I had just written a little monograph called Sitting Bull's Words for a World in Crisis. And he was interviewed one time and said, "How did you keep doing your poetry and your songs and your sun dances and everything in spite of the buffalo being gone and smallpox? Why?" And his answer was, "I want to be a human being." And I said, we got to redefine hope. Hope is a delusion if we see it as the expectation for a certain outcome. He didn't have that. He saw what was happening. We got to redefine hope as a certainty that what we're doing is the right thing to do, regardless of the outcome, and see ourselves as a spirit in this amazing body on this amazing planet, and that this is, you know, someone's gonna have to rebuild, and it could be us coming back, you know. And of course, there's a book called Amerindian Rebirthing that says that 40% of the people in British Columbia come back as trees and animals. So it's not like the reincarnation of the Eastern, but maybe a pelican can help somehow. So I want to play a song and just fade out. You guys can just leave as I play it. On the Trail of Tears, which everyone knows about, the mothers and those who replaced mothers who died sang a lullaby to their children. And the lullaby words were, "But did you see the animals in the clouds and how the clouds are keeping their responsibility to bring us the rain? Did you see the beautiful fish in the creek and how they are keeping the waters clean? Did you see the dancing grasses in the prairie and how they're feeding the animals? And did you hear the beautiful sounds of the meadowlark?" And that was the words that they were singing to these children. And what a powerful thing is, and no matter how tough things are, to see the beauty and to be reminded of the responsibility of our fellow creatures. So as I play the song, think of mothers singing this, and I hope to hear from you, and thank you. Pilamaye. I got to put off the musician thing off. There we go.